Hi, this is Vanessa Gorman, and today's lesson is about the Greek alphabet, pronunciation, accentuation, and related issues. The idea is just to make you not be afraid of looking at a new alphabet. I know a lot of people think it must be awfully hard to learn another alphabet, and I'll grant you that some writing systems can be pretty complex, like Chinese or the Arabic writing, but Greek is not that bad because you have to remember it's an ancestor of our way of writing by way of Latin. And you really pick it up pretty quickly, especially since we are mostly going to be concerned with lowercase letters. And so they're going to look pretty familiar to you as a whole. There are a few things to get used to, but you get used to them pretty quickly. Um, the ones that make the most trouble usually are if you get the new with the kind of V shape confused with the upsilon. Um, I never had a problem with that. Some people do. What I sometimes did was look at the row and say, oh, a P. And in my head, it became a P, even though clearly it's not. So most of the time, it's not bad. And also, the fact is, we mostly look at the lowercase letters in Greek. The uppercase is really only used in texts for proper names and proper adjectives, and for the beginnings of paragraphs, not even the beginnings of sentences. So most of what you will see in texts will be lowercase. Inscriptions, for example, tend to be written in all caps and things like that, but we're not going to be looking at inscriptions in this course. Sigma has several shapes. In the middle of a word, it has this closed shape. At the end of the word, we call it a final sigma because it only occurs at the end of the word. It has this more like what looks like an S shape. So this alphabet, alpha, beta, gamma, delta, those words don't mean anything in Greek except the first letter of the alphabet, the second letter of the alphabet, etc. However, they do mean something in the Phoenician language, which indicates that the alphabet was developed by the Phoenicians. Aleph means ox, Beth means house, Gimel means camel, etc., etc. And you can see sometime in the mid 8th century BCE, after a period of having no writing system at all, the Greeks adopted this alphabet and adapted this alphabet, transforming some of the extra S sounds and other things into vowels. That was the great Greek contribution because, as you might know, Semitic languages basically don't represent vowels with letters. They wind up using diacritical marks. And so the Greek world picked this up. There's a lot of controversy over when and where. Was it to write Homer? Was it for business and trade? Who knows? I'm not going to get into that. But the world picked it up and had slightly different forms initially, but eventually it all becomes kind of a standard alphabet that we use now. And again, most of it is pretty good. This is a nice, you can find the Greek alphabet in a lot of places. I like this chart because it gives you the sound. So alpha as in the A as in fall, D as in dog, E as in ever, zeta as in phase, so more what we would think of as a Z. So you can go down and you can practice your pronunciations. There's a couple of things I should note. One is that if you have two gammas in a row, they're not pronounced just as G, but as NG. So this is where we get the word angel from. It comes from the Greek word angelos, alpha, gamma, gamma. And so that double gamma becomes an NG sound. There's also a number of double consonants, which are consonants that are combined with the S sound. So zeta is actually z, D and S. I should have that reversed. Chi is actually K and S. So sorry, Xi, not Ki. Xi is K and S, and Psi is P and S. Likewise, you have three other consonants that are in my mind, double, although they're not considered that way because what you've added to them is the H sound, the aspirants. The H sound isn't a separate letter in Greek. So to add the H sound to the T, you get the theta. To add it to the P, you get the F. To add it to the K, you get the key. There are also 7 Greek vowels. Alpha, epsilon, eta, iota, omicron, upsilon, omega. So you see O micron, little o, and omega, big O. So the omicron is short and the omega is long. The iota is usually short, but there are a few places where it's long. Epsilon is the short version of the E. Eta is the long version of the E. So you see there's no second choice there. Alphas and upsilons are pretty much a toss-up whether they're long or short vowels. Likewise, we get diphthongs, combinations of different vowels, a iota or an upsilon combined with another vowel. And so we do get 8 diphthong sounds that are usually long metrically, but they're not always long. And you see here the pronunciation guides. AI, alpha iota, is pronounced I. Epsilon iota, A. Omicron iota, oi. Upsilon iota, we, kind of like sweet. Ow. And then oo at the bottom. I've crossed off au because we don't have any English word that pronounces like that. It's not deuce, it's au. And so if you have an epsilon or an eta combined with a upsilon, you want the au sound. It sounds like 2 syllables to us, but it's 1. So these are your diphthongs. Some of them get weak enough that they kind of lose their iota, and we'll talk about those in a second. Meanwhile, I want to talk about accents and punctuation and diacritical marks. Remember, we're not aiming to produce Greek forms, but to read them. So knowing the pronunciation helps your brain remember things. So I always advise you to read things out loud as you're translating them because it's just helpful to learn it. Even if your pronunciation is horrible, like mine is, who cares? No one's going to listen to you. Now, the Greek world had pitch rather than stress accents, and this is something that we can't really do very well because we use stress accents, but it makes it into a kind of a sing-song, really pretty sound. And at the end of this lesson, I'm going to give you some links to hear some examples of Greek being read with a pitch accent that are really nicely done. Originally, most Greek was written without word division or punctuation in the 5th and 4th centuries. That was all added subsequently, starting with the Alexandrians in around 300 and later. And so they actually added vowels and, or not vowels, accents and breathing marks and things in order to help us read them, and bless them for doing it. But that also means you have to have the breathing and the accent to make it spelled correctly. It's part of the correct spelling. You can't just skip this stuff. Now, breathing marks. Breathing marks indicate the presence or absence of an H sound at the beginning of a word. And so they only occur if the word begins with a vowel or with the letter rho. And generally the rho has a hard breathing. It has the H sound. If it begins with a diphthong, the breathing mark is going to be on the second letter of the diphthong. So we have the smooth breathing, which is just an apostrophe over the vowel, or if it's a capital vowel in front of it, if it's a diphthong on the second letter. So we have anabibadze, engus, athenaioi, auton, and uden. The rough breathing, on the other hand, is just a reversed accent, and it indicates aspiration. So heuautu, so hopos, radios, rhetor, and hylon. So you always add the H sound when you have the reversed apostrophe, the rough breathing. Now, accents, there's a few rules about accents. I told you already about pitch versus stress. Um, they can only occur on vowels. If it's on a diphthong, it's over the second vowel of the diphthong, just like the breathing, and it follows the breathing. It's not in front of the breathing if they have both. The other thing is it can only occur on the final 3 syllables. So we call them the ultimate, the last syllable, the penultimate, the next to last, and the antepenultimate, before the next to last. So the second from the end, we would say. And there's 3 possible accents, the acute, the grave, and the circumflex. And so the acute looks like an accent leaning to the right, the grave looks like an accent leaning to the left, and the circumflex is originally supposed to be a combination of those 2, so it's usually a squiggly line of some sort. Now the acute accent can occur on any of the last 3 syllables. It's the only one that can occur on the antepenult. This is kind of your workhorse accent. It's what you see far and away the most. It can be on the last syllable only if that ends a sentence or a clause, or there's an unaccented word following it. There are a few small unaccented words we'll talk about. In other words, if it's at the end of the word leading into another word, typically you flip it over into a grave is what happens. Here we have instances of being at the end of a sentence or the end of a clause, and so the acute accent is retained here. Okay, you see an acute accent here because there's no accent on te. It's something we call an enclitic. There's an acute accent here because it's in the middle of the word. There's also the rule that it can only be on the antepenult if the final syllable is short, whether by nature or by position. So because parakaleu eto tells us that the O at the end is short because it's been able to pop back 2 syllables. Same thing with the name Pharnabatzis. It tells you that the final syllable is short. Interestingly enough, we have some words that look like the final syllable should be short, the nominative plurals, and yet for rules of accentuation, it acts long, or it acts short. Even though it's a diphthong, it looks like it ought to be long, right? So there are some words like this. Typically, it's the nominatives, plurals. So if the accent is on the last syllable and it's short, and another word follows, it flips over to the grave. So like the kai here, kai politea. So it can only occur on the last syllable. So, and only if another word follows. So deduce kai hulein, kaitain decatain ex elegon. And here you see se lumbrianoi de edexanto men u cremata de edosin. So these are places where you would have had an acute accent if they were at the end of the word, but because there's something following it, they get the grave. Now, u here is the end of a clause, so it keeps the original acute accent. And then finally, we have the circumflex accent, which can only occur on the last 2 syllables. It cannot go back to the antepenult. It can only occur on a long vowel. So it will never occur on a short vowel. So for example, if you look at Heyman here, it tells you that that iota must be long because it's able to take a circumflex. If you contract a verb, like naumachia, naumachiaoi contracts into naumachein, it's always going to have a diphthong where you've dropped out a vowel, and we'll talk about those more when we get into verbs next. It also can only occur on the penultimate, the next to last, if the final vowel is short. If this vowel were long, this would have to be an acute. If this vowel is short and this is a long and it takes an accent, it will take the circumflex. Now, do you need to memorize all these rules? Not if you don't want to. I mean, sometimes they help you tell the words apart. But the fact is, again, you're not trying to reproduce them. So there's no reason to obsess about memorizing these rules. You need to be aware of them. You need to be able to look them up when you need to look them up, but don't obsess about them unless it just amuses you and you want to pursue it even further. Okay? Couple of other miscellaneous things. Accents on nouns are persistent. That is, wherever the accent started, that's where the accent wants to try to stay, if it can. Um, if the accent is on the last syllable in the lemma, then it's going to try to stay there anytime it possibly can. If the accent occurs on the penult, it will try to stay there as long as it can. So accents on nouns are persistent. On the other hand, accents on verbs are what we call recessive. They try to move as early in the word as the rules of accentuation allow. So their accents are going to vary much more depending on the quantity of the vowels. And then also, a lot of words that end with a short epsilon, especially in the verbs in the third person singular, they will get what we call a movable nu. This is the equivalent of what we do when we put an N on the end of the word a before a word beginning with a vowel. So it's a truck, but unambulance, right? So this movable nu is used periodically in Greek, not always, but it's used periodically to break up vowels in a row that are pronounced discreetly. Some places much more than others, like I say, especially in the third person singular. Then there are words that don't have accents. There's not that many of these. They tend to be very short. They come in two forms. One are the enclitics, which literally means they lean backwards. And they're so short and unstressed that they become part of the word before them, even though they're written separately. But for accentuation purposes, you just act as if they're part of the word before them. So they usually lose their accent unless they're followed by another enclitic. So a, pu, tis, tina are all enclitics, and the tina gives its accent to the tis gives its accent to the poo gives its accent to the a. So the last one is the only one unaccented because it's kind of like playing a game of dominoes. Sometimes when it wants to give its accent to the word before, the result is we wind up in a situation where normally we just keep the accent of the word before. But if that accent is too far away from the end of this new word, so in other words, parenesan is a perfectly good word here. But then when you add the te on the end, that means that the original accent is not within the last three syllables of the end of the word. It's now four syllables in, so you have to add a second accent near the end. Same thing with cremata te. Cremata is accented on the eta, but once you add this te on here, it's like adding another syllable to the word, and we have to add another accent. Does that make sense? I hope it makes sense. Likewise, we have words that lean forward, proclinics. Any articles that begin with a vowel, so the nominative of the word the is a proclitic. Some prepositions and the word no. So these are fairly common as a whole. And again, they just glom onto the front of the next word, but they aren't going to really affect the accent because the accent is going to stay where it was originally because the accent comes back from the back of the word, not forward from the front of the word. So we get the preposition into the Hellespont. So ace has no accent here. Into Lampsakis, it has no accent here. This is the word the army, and it has no accent because it's just pronounced essentially as part of that word. Very rarely a proclitic will take an accent, but is very, very rarely right before an enclitic or at the end of a sentence. So let's also talk about punctuation while we're at it. Again, this was all added after the fact by those wonderful Alexandrians. The period and the comma function in Greek the same way you and I use them. The semicolon, however, is actually stands for a question mark. So when you see a semicolon, it is a question. When you see what's called a raised dot, which is like the top dot of a colon, that's the semicolon, and we just call it a raised dot. Some words have what used to be some kind of diphthong, but then the iota becomes so weak it's not pronounced anymore. And that is indicated sometimes by writing it out, but more usually it's turned into what we call the iota subscript, and it's just a little tail at the bottom of an alpha, an eta, or an omega. So you see the difference between high, which keeps the iota and it's pronounced, and pario. We don't bother pronouncing that iota here. Te, there's a iota subscript here. Hysteria, there's a iota subscript there, but you don't pronounce it. It's just part of the spelling. They're typical in dative singulars, especially in the first and second declension. There's also something called the diaeresis, which simply means sometimes what looks like a diphthong is not a diphthong. You pronounce the word separately. And so we put two dots over the second one to indicate that you pronounce it separately. It's like we do in English with naive and sometimes with words like re-elect or cooperate. So nei and proeteon are pronounced as separate vowels. They're not very common, but you do see them here and there. So I just wanted to warn you about it. So now for resources, there's some really good online pronunciation guides. Mastronardo's Attic Greek page has some really good pronunciation guides for the individual letters especially, and so it's a good place to go to hear people who speak well giving you examples of the pronunciation. But what I really love are these Podium Arts excellent readings on YouTube, where you have someone who is very practiced with the pitch accent reading some ancient text, just a short bit of each ancient text, just a paragraph or so. So Homer's Odyssey, Plato's Apology, Aristotle's Politics, just a paragraph, and they have the Greek text there for you to read along as they're pronouncing it. So that's a really nice resource, and I think it's fantastic. Also, in case you want to know more about accentuation, you can go to any textbook, including Smythe has a long, long section. There are exceptions for almost any rule. That's always the case with grammar. There are exceptions for almost any rule, but what I've given you are the basic rules. There is an accentuation tutorial that if you want to go explore more, that's another nice place to go. So you should be more comfortable by now with the alphabet and with pronunciation, I hope.